It starts in America's heartland, a strange and lethal disease that attacks women. Hospitals struggle to treat the victims as a regional outbreak turns into a national epidemic. The crisis grows as the death toll rises. Public health officials must race to solve the mystery, to track the source of this deadly infection before it can kill again. Some of the names in this program have been changed. December 1979. A crosstown bus in Madison, Wisconsin. A young woman, by all appearances, in perfect health. Until her collapse was sudden and terrifying. Unconscious, barely breathing, the young woman lay sprawled out in the aisle. Responding within minutes, paramedics rushed to the scene. And what they found concerned them. The young woman had a high fever, her pulse was weak, and her blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Fortunately, the University of Wisconsin Medical Center was only moments away. By the time they reached the emergency room, she was going into shock. The ER staff would have to work fast.
Start getting vital.
They had no clues to work with. Only a driver's license with her name, Emily Murray, and her age, just 18 years old. Meanwhile, her blood pressure was continuing to plummet, and an odd pink rash had appeared on her face and hands. As the ER team fought to stabilize her, throat and blood cultures as well as blood samples were sent off to the lab. The cultures would take 24 hours to grow. Emily was moved to the intensive care unit, where she was placed on kidney dialysis and her vital signs could be closely monitored. She seemed to stabilize, and then her case took a strange turn. The mysterious rash became more pronounced. It now covered her entire body.
She hadn't had an accident.
Urologist Dr. Russell Chesney was called in. His first priority to bring her out of shock, to figure out what was going on.
I knew that I'd never seen anybody look quite like this. She had this rash, this sunburn rash, and it was spreading. It was something that was affecting all of her organs. She had bad lungs, she had shock, she had profound diarrhea, she had kidney failure.
The sudden onset of Emily's symptoms and the bizarre red rash made Dr. Chesney suspect she had contracted a severe infection. There was no time to wait for lab results. He had to act immediately and aggressively.
Do you know where you are? So we treated her with a very broad spectrum of antibiotics, kind of a shotgun approach, if you will. And we wanted to make sure that if this were an infection, that we were preventing it from spreading and that we were preventing the organisms from persisting.
The doctors called in Emily's distraught parents, trying to find any possible clue to what had made her so sick.
The parents really indicated that she hadn't been exposed to anything. There was nobody else in the family sick. She had some siblings and they were perfectly well, and the parents were perfectly well. Nobody was sick at home. Nobody was sick at school.
And that's really intriguing.
Examining Emily's chest x-rays, Dr. Chesney tried to understand what had happened.
Her cardiac silhouette is not that full. It's narrow like we would see with shock. And she certainly doesn't have congestive heart failure or anything. There are no curly B lines.
What he saw was perplexing. It didn't make any sense.
The thing that was confusing to us in looking at her chest, it was clear she didn't have pneumonia. And she also didn't have a collapse of her lungs or anything like that. What she actually had was she had hemorrhage from the lung.
Emily's lungs were bleeding. It was hard for her to breathe. Dr. Chesney recognized this was a dangerous and potentially deadly complication. But Chesney had no idea what the cause was. The more he learned about her case, the more baffled he became. Her symptoms seemed random, disconnected. It was the nightmare of any parent. That morning, their daughter had left the house a healthy teenager. Now, she was hooked up to IV lines and monitors. Luckily, IV fluids and dialysis eventually began to help. Emily's blood pressure started to rise to a safer level.
And it stayed there for an hour or two, and I felt comfortable in going home and trying to find out more about this.
With the patient finally stable, Chesney could concentrate on the diagnosis. He sought a second opinion from his wife.
Is this the teenager that they...
Dr. Joan Chesney is the head of the Infectious Disease Division at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine.
What is it that really...
The patient's high fever, diarrhea, and dehydration were all classic symptoms of an infection.
But she has a lot of other extra features that just don't make sense.
Like what?
Well, one of the things she has is a rash that is spreading like crazy. Total body rash, angry looking. I really can't figure what's going on.
To Dr. Joan Chesney, the symptoms sounded familiar.
Let me ask you just one question. Does she have bright red eyes?
A red rash and red eyes. It reminded Joan of a journal article she had recently seen by a doctor in Colorado. The article outlined a new syndrome called toxic shock, characterized by shock, a rash, and multi-organ disease. The illness was linked to a toxin produced by the bacteria Staphylococcus aureus. The disease was named toxic shock syndrome. In extreme cases, it could be fatal. The next morning, Joan Chesney came in to examine Emily Murray. In her 11 years studying infectious diseases, she had never seen anything like it. Blood vessels became inflamed when the bacteria released its toxins, causing a rash that covered Emily's entire body, even her palms. In the journal article, the Staph aureus bacteria was described as infecting the patient's bodies through an open wound. But Emily did not have any cuts or wounds for the bacteria to infect, so where had it come from?
My biggest question was, is this toxic shock syndrome as he described it? But I was very skeptical about the Staph aureus, particularly because she didn't have any infection site.
Emily did have many of the same symptoms. She even developed small hemorrhages in her eyes. Chesney was determined to unravel this medical mystery.
There are other bacterial infections that can cause shock and multi-system disease, but they don't generally cause the rash or the red eyes. So it was one of those things that you just had a sixth sense that there was something not right about this.
Emily fit the description of toxic shock syndrome, but not completely.
Really, really sick, and it's very puzzling.
Joan Chesney wondered if they were seeing the birth of a new and terrifying disease.
You have to make yourself keep an open mind to the fact that it might be a new virus, it might be a new bacteria. We were wondering if it could have been some kind of chemical reaction, that she'd maybe absorbed a chemical through her skin or taken a drug that nobody knew about.
Then, just hours later, a second case appeared. 19-year-old Kaylee Wilson was rushed to the University of Wisconsin Medical Center. Like Emily, she arrived in the ER with a raging fever, extremely low blood pressure, and a bizarre red rash. The ER staff pumped her with fluids, desperately trying to raise her blood pressure. Kaylee's mother was frantic. The girl was fighting for her life. Joan Chesney was immediately notified.
We see patients all the time who have very unusual presentations of some disease, but there's only one of them, and we often don't figure out what it is, no matter how hard we try. But here we had two, right, less than 24 hours apart, both of whom were very sick.
The similarity between the two cases was uncanny. Joan's experience with infectious diseases told her this couldn't be a coincidence. She recommended supportive treatment, massive amounts of IV fluid, and a broad spectrum of antibiotics. Soon after Kaylee was admitted, Joan learned that a third case of the mysterious illness was being treated at a hospital just across town. This was no random event. This was the beginning of something widespread, something far-reaching. This was the start of an epidemic.
To say my heart rate doubled would be an understatement. It was scary.
Joan knew it was time to bring in the director of the Wisconsin Department of Health, Dr. Jeff Davis.
The fact that 3 cases were occurring in one community simultaneously certainly was of impact. We felt it was certainly unusual and needed to be investigated right away.
As chief epidemiologist for the state of Wisconsin, it was Dr. Davis's job to make sense of this outbreak. To figure out how these 3 cases were related. Had the young women all been exposed to something in common? What was the source of the illness? Dr. Davis interviewed the 3 patients, asking about pets, allergies, dietary habits, anything that might provide a link, a clue to the origin of this mysterious infection.
We asked about a lot of activities. These were fairly far-reaching, where people shopped, where they went, what their usual activities were.
Davis then compared the interviews, looking for overlapping data, the one key point where the patients' lives intersected. What he found was absolutely nothing.
Except for the fact that they were women, and they were from basically the greater Madison area. They didn't have anything in common.
The mystery was growing, and unless doctors and public health officials could identify the source of the toxic infection, more young women could be in danger. A strange outbreak, a mysterious infection. And in Madison, Wisconsin, young women were being rushed to the hospital. In each case, the symptoms were the same. High fever, dangerously low blood pressure, signs of shock, and a bizarre sunburn-like rash. As doctors struggled to keep the women alive, health officials worked round the clock to find the cause. Wisconsin state epidemiologist Dr. Jeff Davis combed through the women's medical records, searching for clues. What did these patients have in common? The only thing they shared was that they were all young and they were all women. It seemed like nothing. In fact, it was the beginning of an answer.
So that's when I thought, what differentiates women from men? And given their age, I thought that menstruation may be a factor.
Unfortunately, the medical files had no record of menstrual cycles. Dr. Davis would have to revisit the patients. Emily Murray, the first, was in the best shape of the three. Her kidneys were failing, and she had been put on dialysis. But she was at least lucid enough to talk.
The time that you became ill, do you recall whether you may have been menstruating at that time?
Yes.
Regular since that time? Normal monthly periods?
Over the next day, the other patients told him the same thing. They had both been menstruating when they got sick. At last, Davis had found something all the patients had in common. But what did it mean? Was it even significant? He shared his findings with infectious disease expert Dr. Joan Chesney. She was skeptical.
My reaction was, well, Jeff, if you take any group of young women at one point in time, you know, a significant number are going to be having their period. And he said, well, I know, but I just can't find anything else.
But Davis's interviews uncovered another clue supporting his suspicions. One of the women had suffered similar but less severe symptoms a month before. The implications were frightening. Had the young women taken a pain reliever that was contaminated, a tainted batch of oral contraceptives? Davis and Chesney wondered if other doctors in the area were seeing the same strange illness. It was time to get the word out, to get as many brains working on the mystery as possible.
We felt a real sense of urgency to let other people know as quickly as possible and to see if people had seen it, not recognized it, to be sure we picked up any additional cases.
Dr. Chesney presented her cases at a hospital conference on infectious disease.
Thank you all for coming. We wanted to tell you about 3 patients that we've seen in the last 2 days. And we wanted to bring it to your attention so that if any of you saw a patient with this in the next few months, or if you've seen a patient with this over the last 6 months, please let us know. I'm sure it's not just going on here in Madison, but it's probably...
When she asked if anyone had seen patients with similar symptoms, a medical resident spoke up.
Dr. Chesney, I saw a similar patient 6 months ago.
He had treated a young woman in her teens a few months earlier. Dr. Chesney asked to look at the patient's records.
We're all quite concerned about it right now. Thank you again for letting us come today.
As she reviewed the file, Dr. Chesney saw all the telltale signs.
Look, she was in shock at the time, and she had a rash, just like I told you earlier.
Right, and the red eyes you had mentioned to me. The key thing is whether anybody recorded that she was having her period when all of this started. Did you find it?
Here it is. They did document that she was having her period at the time of her symptoms.
This was yet another documented case of the mysterious illness. Wisconsin was firmly in the grip of an outbreak. Soon, another teenager was being admitted to the Wisconsin Medical Center. Like the other women when she arrived at the ER, she was disoriented and covered with a bright red rash.
Is she allergic to anything? I think she's allergic to penicillin. Has she been on penicillin recently? No, not recently.
Joan, have you heard there's another teenager in the emergency room with a diffuse rash and shock, and they'd like you to come now, please.
Hi, Allison. My name's Dr. Chesney.
This new patient was also menstruating.
She feels we do have a clue, we think, as to what's going on here. And
Dr. Chesney had been developing a theory about the source of infection. Since the patients were all menstruating at the onset of illness, Chesney ordered a vaginal culture to test for bacteria. In the lab, the culture was incubated on a growth medium. 24 hours later, it was placed in a reagent solution and identified as Staphylococcus aureus, the bacteria associated with toxic shock syndrome. Joan Chesney's initial diagnosis had proven correct.
And sure enough, it was what we call a pure culture. That was the only bacteria that grew, and it was a heavy growth. So that was our first hard clue that maybe our thoughts were going in the right direction.
For Dr. Jeff Davis, the epidemiologist, it was time to place the entire state on alert. He notified over 3,500 physicians that Wisconsin was facing an outbreak of the deadly toxic shock syndrome. He requested information and sample cultures from any patients who displayed symptoms.
It was important to get this letter out because they needed to learn about the illness. They needed to know what was occurring. We made recommendations for what laboratory tests to obtain, and so that expanded their ability to get the appropriate tests.
In a time before email, Davis's letter on toxic shock was distributed the old-fashioned way, by U.S. mail. But all across the state, physicians got the message: watch out for unusual cases.
It was really that very, very unique combination of symptoms and signs that we tried to let people know about. And, don't give them some penicillin and send them home because they won't be better in the morning. You need to get them to the hospital right away.
The response was overwhelming. Hospitals statewide reported cases of the deadly illness, not just one or two, but hundreds of them. Young women all over Wisconsin were infected with toxic shock syndrome, and health officials had no idea why. In 1980, dozens of young Wisconsin women were coming down with a disease no one had ever heard of before: menstrual toxic shock syndrome. The local doctors were baffled. More cases were appearing across the state. And then, several weeks into the outbreak, the Wisconsin Department of Health learned that 3 women in Minnesota had also been hospitalized with unusual symptoms. Epidemiologist Jeff Davis was baffled. Toxic shock syndrome is not contagious. How would it spread to another state?
We discussed the importance of reporting this to CDC, because clearly this was going on in a couple of states.
At the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Dr. Bruce Dan was part of the investigation.
To suddenly hear that women in Wisconsin, Minnesota were having the same symptoms, and not just the same symptoms, very strange collection of symptoms. You don't have to be a really trained epidemiologist to realize you had a real epidemic on your hands and something very strange was going on.
Fever, vomiting, diarrhea.
In all his experience with the CDC's Epidemiologic Intelligence Service, Dan had never encountered toxic shock syndrome. He tried to learn all he could.
It was important for us to talk to a lot of experienced investigators, infectious disease experts, who had seen years and years of disease, especially in medical centers and universities where they get referred lots of very unusual cases. And they said, we have never, ever seen anything like this before. You guys are handling something totally new, totally unrecognized as far as we're concerned.
The CDC's investigative team rolled into action. To learn the scope of danger, health departments across America were contacted by CDC lead investigator, Catherine Shands.
We needed to figure out whether this was a regional outbreak or a national outbreak. And so we began to put out the word and ask people, had they seen this illness in other locations than Wisconsin and Minnesota?
Only 2 things were certain. Toxic shock syndrome was dangerous, and it was spreading. On Sunday, February 8, 1980, Ronald and Jeanette Dulick were on their way to church. Geraldine, their 16-year-old daughter, was running late. At St. Mary's Hospital in Milwaukee, an emergency team sprang into action. As Geraldine flickered in and out of consciousness, the ER staff charted her vital signs. the teenager was suffering from multiple high-risk symptoms. Her heart was inflamed, and her temperature soared to 106 degrees. Doctors struggled to make a diagnosis until the attending physician received Jeff Davis's letter. He recognized his patient's symptoms as a textbook case of the brand new epidemic. Meeting with Geraldine's family, the doctor asked if she had been menstruating when she became sick. She had. Their answer confirmed his diagnosis: toxic shock syndrome. He would need to contact the Wisconsin Department of Health to get the latest information on treatment. With her life hanging in the balance, Geraldine was given fluids to rehydrate her and help raise her blood pressure. She was also given an antibiotic to combat the staph infection. If Geraldine stood any chance of survival, treatment would have to take effect quickly. News of the 16-year-old's desperate condition reached Neil Rosenberg, a Milwaukee-based health reporter. He was intrigued by the mysterious illness.
When I first heard about Geraldine Dulac, it came not with a name, but fear in the voice of an anonymous caller. I was sitting at my desk, looking for a story as I usually do, when the phone rang, and there was a person who said a young woman was seriously ill, critically ill, he said, on the south side of Milwaukee from a killer virus.
Tracking the story, Rosenberg contacted Dr. Jeff Davis at the Wisconsin Department of Health. He learned the mysterious illness had a surprising connection.
He gave me a graphic description of the symptoms. And at one point in it, I said, "Is there any common link?" He said they were all menstruating. And that really threw me for a loop. And I said, "Well, what do you think that means?" And he says, "We really don't know, Neil. That's what we're looking into."
Rosenberg's story made front-page news. For Jeff Davis and the Department of Health, it also opened a floodgate.
That article had a lot of information about toxic shock syndrome. And I started getting a lot of phone calls, a huge number of phone calls. And so that article had an extraordinary impact.
Hundreds of calls began pouring in. Physicians called to report suspected cases. Women called to share their stories of surviving a bout with the deadly syndrome. Astonished by the response, Davis launched a case study to analyze the data. Health officials worked non-stop gathering information. They had to find the link between toxic shock syndrome and menstruation. Through scores of interviews, the team compared 35 confirmed cases of toxic shock to a larger control group of healthy women. All the women, healthy or infected, lived in the same area. They were all about the same age and shared similar lifestyles. The health department also conducted field interviews with the participants.
Thank you for letting me come over. I just want to ask you a few questions about your recent house.
Some of the women described feeling unusually sick every time they got their periods.
But I got this rash all over me. It looked like sunburn, and I was just feeling sick.
But their symptoms had not escalated, unlike Geraldine Dulac. At St. Mary's Hospital, the teenager was getting worse. Her condition had been steadily deteriorating. Finally, after 20 days in the hospital, she slipped into an irreversible coma. And on February 28th, Geraldine Dulac died from catastrophic organ failure. Wisconsin had lost its first victim to toxic shock syndrome. She would not be the last. Until 1980, the American public had never heard of toxic shock syndrome. But now the rare bacterial infection was erupting in the Midwest. One teenager had already died in Wisconsin. Now the disease showed up in Iowa. On May 16th, 36-year-old Chris Laycock was rushed to the hospital. Her liver and kidneys were failing. The emergency room team worked hard to stabilize their patient.
Heart, lungs are normal, so just pretty tacky.
They called in the hospital's infectious disease expert, Dr. Charles Helms.
So I got a call from Dr. Lengling, who was the resident on call in the intensive care unit, the medical intensive care unit, about a case that was really had him worried and concerned and wanted an infectious disease consult.
Dr. Helms had never seen anything like it. It was as if the patient's entire body was shutting down, one organ after another.
It's unusual to see a young, healthy person, as she was, come in so desperately ill, particularly with so many systems of her body involved.
As her condition got worse, Chris was moved to the intensive care unit where she could be monitored. In addition to her liver and kidneys, her lungs were failing.
And perhaps of most concern to us here, her respiratory status, her ability to breathe and oxygenate her blood was in dire straits.
Doctors rushed to intubate the patient. They put her on a respirator. Her blood pressure was crashing. Her organs weren't functioning. They were losing her. Their only hope of keeping Chris alive was to raise her blood pressure, to get blood to her vital organs. Despite the CDC's efforts, not all doctors were aware that a strange infection was on the move.
If it was a bacterial infection, that she was on a sufficiently broad range of antibiotics to protect her while we figured out what was going on with her.
Chris Laycock was placed on life support in the ICU. Her family sat by her side as she slipped into a coma. But Chris was not alone. Toxic shock was now a national problem. At the CDC, the calls were streaming in. Hundreds of girls were sick, and some were dying. Epidemiologist Bruce Dan tracked the outbreak.
It was happening nationally in a dozen states all over the country. Suddenly, young, previously healthy women who were going about their life, going to high school, going to college, going to work, raising kids, suddenly get ill as if they had the flu, and some of them would be dead in the next 12 or 24 hours from a totally unknown cause. That's frightening.
Continue to work on that.
The CDC task force kept running totals of confirmed toxic shock cases. Reports were coming in from all over the country. Nationwide, the death toll had risen to 7.
As the numbers kept pouring in, we got more and more calls saying we've seen another case and another case and another case. There was a lot of pressure to say we have to solve this very quickly, find the answer to stop this epidemic and save a lot of lives.
The CDC put together an MMWR, a mortality and morbidity weekly report on toxic shock syndrome. It was an alert to physicians and hospitals all across the country. The MMWR would help doctors make an early diagnosis of toxic shock patients.
It's basically the CDC's mechanism for getting information out to doctors, nurses, health officials across the country. It's also a mechanism for getting information back in.
The CDC's report arrived at the Iowa hospital just in time. Dr. Helms recognized Chris Laycock's symptoms immediately. It was textbook toxic shock syndrome. Dr. Helms followed the CDC's recommendations: massive amounts of fluids and antibiotics to fight infection. For now, her terrified family could only watch and wait. Back at the CDC, the numbers continued to rise. 107 cases had now surfaced in 33 separate states. Clearly, this was the beginning of a nationwide epidemic. But what was causing it?
Your first hunch, if you want to play hunches, is probably maybe these are women who got a bad batch of some medication that women commonly take during their menstrual period for aches and pains and so forth. But you can't play your hunches when you're dealing with something like this. You have to do a real study.
And so the CDC launched a nationwide hunt to discover the cause of toxic shock.
You've got names of 50 women from their medical records in hospitals across the United States. How do you find them? How do you call them? Where are they now?
For each patient, they needed to interview 3 control subjects. They asked each of the patients for the names of 3 friends.
So it's not just a matter of making 200 phone calls, but maybe 400, 800, 1,000 phone calls to get hold of all these people. It took a huge amount of work, and we had a very short time to do it.
With the days passing and more women falling ill, health officials raced to get to the bottom of the mystery.
So we devised a questionnaire, about 125, 150 questions, asking everything we could think about their current health status, medications they may be taking, certainly everything we could think of about their menstrual period. Do you wear pads or tampons? Do you exercise during your period? Do you jog? Do you take showers? Do you take baths? What do you do unusual or not do unusual during your period? To get an idea of what would make the cases different than the controls. Why did the one group of young women get toxic shock syndrome and get violently ill, and other women were totally healthy? And it was clear to us that if you asked enough questions, you would probably find out why women with toxic shock syndrome were different than other women. Turns out the answer surprised us.
After weeks of medical detective work, the CDC investigators had found the common link. There was one thing that set the women with toxic shock apart. 100% of them used tampons.
What could it be about tampons that would cause this severe disease and cause women to die? They've been in use for 50 years. 50 million women a month use them in the United States. There were all kind of brands out there. They were commonplace. And it didn't make a lot of scientific sense from a biological point of view. What could it be about a tampon that could kill you?
But because of the potential threat,
The solution to one mystery was the beginning of the next. CDC investigators presented their startling findings to every tampon manufacturer in the country.
We invited the tampon manufacturers to come down to Atlanta to CDC to discuss with us, first of all, to tell them what the results of our study were, so they would be aware. And secondly, to find out from them, tell us about tampons. How are they made? Where are they made? What are they made of?
The executives agreed to provide the CDC with the information. But on one point, they were unequivocal. They had no intention of taking their products off the market. They believed the scientific proof was lacking. Still, CDC investigator Catherine Shands felt the evidence linking tampons to toxic shock was clear enough.
The disease needed 2 things to occur. One was the presence of Staph aureus, and actually an infection with Staph aureus. The other was the use of tampons.
And so the CDC went public with their findings. They needed to warn women about the potential threat. But the mystery was far from solved. Dozens of questions still lingered. Investigators needed to conduct a second study to determine why tampons were making women sick. What caused the infection? Had specific brands become contaminated?
So we collected tampons to test them in the laboratory to see if any particular tampon, any brand, any style, from any kind of manufacturing location might be contaminated. And though we looked at hundreds and thousands of tampons, hundreds and thousands of hours of laboratory time to look for it, we couldn't find any particular tampon that were contaminated with anything that would cause a disease.
The story of the outbreak made national headlines. All over America, women were confused and terrified.
This was also under sort of a national spotlight. And suddenly, not only do you have the spotlight on you from just your local colleagues, but the director of CDC, the Surgeon General, The Department of Health and Human Services Secretary and even the presidential office is looking very quickly at you to say, hey, this is a real problem. Are you guys going to solve it?
Throughout the summer and fall, the epidemic raged on, and panic began to set in as more and more women found themselves in a battle with a mysterious disease, fighting for their lives. All across America, women were dying, and health officials didn't know why. As scientists raced to find answers, more patients were being rushed to the hospital. Patients like 25-year-old Pat Kemp, the mother of 2 small children. She had early flu-like symptoms. Now, she was in the ER. And her husband, Mike, was worried.
Every 15 or 20 minutes, I was allowed to enter into the emergency room. I could hold her hand. She was having such a difficult time breathing. She wasn't able to communicate very well with me, but I could squeeze her hand and she could squeeze it back.
As Pat's condition deteriorated, Mike grew more concerned.
To think that just a few days prior, she was the young, healthy mother of my children, and we were enjoying life and making plans for our future, to see her in a hospital setting, looking totally unlike her normal self and fighting to take every breath.
The medical community was now on high alert for patients who showed signs of toxic shock syndrome. And Pat Kemp was a classic case. Admitted to the ICU, Pat was treated with antibiotics to fight the infection. But her situation was grave, and Mike could see she had taken a turn for the worse.
I was so alarmed at how her coloring had changed, and later I understood that that was because her blood vessels were bursting under her skin due to the toxins and the poison in her body. And I said, well, doctor, what's the worst thing I can expect? And he said, Mike, that's a good question to ask. You know, my fear was, would she have lung damage or brain damage or some other organ that could be damaged by all this? And he said, you know, that's a fair question, but our fight right now is just to try to keep her alive. And at that point, it dawned on me just how critical she was.
I understand.
Even as Pat Kemp lay on that hospital bed, the CDC was working around the clock to pinpoint the source of her infection. Was it a style of tampon, one specific brand? That's when investigators had a breakthrough.
In this particular study, one particular brand of tampon accounted for about 2/3 of all the cases. And it was a brand of tampon that only about a fifth of women in the United States were using. So something was highly risky about this tampon.
The brand was a relatively new product that had been aggressively marketed as a super absorbent tampon. The manufacturer had spent millions of dollars promoting it to women nationwide.
They told us that they had made changes in the composition of tampons over the last several years. Prior to 1975, all tampons had been made of cotton and rayon, and they had begun introducing high absorbency chemical materials into tampons to obviously to increase the absorbency.
The FDA acted swiftly and pulled the brand from the shelves.
When they did that, the number of cases of toxic shock syndrome dropped off dramatically. And not surprisingly, if a tampon is responsible for 2/3 of the cases, removing that tampon from the market as quickly as you can will reduce the number of cases.
The CDC got the word out. Tampons were directly linked to toxic shock syndrome. But for Pat Kemp, it was already too late. Despite the doctor's rapid diagnosis, she lay in a coma, unable to breathe on her own.
And I would spend the evening with her at the hospital. She squeezed my hand, and tears were flowing down her cheeks, and those tears were red because of the blood vessels bursting in her eyes and so on.
On September 6, 1980, Pat Kemp lost her battle with toxic shock syndrome. another victim of this terrible plague. But the story wasn't over. Although one brand of tampons had been pulled from the shelves, more cases of the infection turned up at hospitals around the country. Women were getting sick while using other brands, and no one knew exactly why. Absorbency levels seemed to be a factor, as well as how long they remained inside the body. To alert the public, the FDA required tampon manufacturers to include information in their packaging about toxic shock syndrome and how to avoid it. In Iowa, Chris Laycock spent weeks lying near death. Finally, the aggressive antibiotic therapy kicked in. Her body fought off the Staph aureus bacteria. Chris's doctor, Richard Helms, credits the research of the CDC for saving her life.
Chris was fortunate that she came in to a hospital in this country at that particular point in the evolution of American medicine, where we had a syndrome, where we had an approach to that syndrome, and that syndrome included treatment of Staphylococcus aureus.
Never been.
Nearly a month after she was admitted, Chris Laycock was released from the hospital. Today, she's still thankful for Dr. Helms' quick thinking.
They saved my life. There's no doubt about it. They saved my life. They were on top of it. They had to try a lot of different things. You have to realize that my kidneys failed. I went into congestive heart failure. I was being kept alive by life support, and they kept me alive. And I'm very, very, very grateful to them.
In the span of one unfortunate year, hundreds of young women were infected with toxic shock syndrome. 37 of them died. Dozens more suffered lingering pain and trauma. But women like Chris Laycock, like Emily Murray and Kaylee Wilson, all survived in the end. In the following years, researchers got a much clearer idea of what had caused the outbreak. The tampons were the culprit. The new synthetic materials simply worked too well. They became tiny incubators for disease, the perfect growth medium for the Staph aureus bacteria. Manufacturers went back to old-fashioned cotton and rayon, and health officials got out the warning: the need to change tampons regularly and watch for flu-like symptoms. The outbreak taught larger lessons as well.
I think one of the lessons of toxic shock syndrome is that, just as much as we've learned about bioterrorism and anthrax lately, is that you need to have a group of highly trained professionals who at a moment's notice can look into, solve, and fix an epidemic. One of the things about epidemics is you never know where they're going to happen or where they're going to come from.
The key is early detection and swift reaction. Mike Kemp and his wife's sister Carol have become advocates for women's health.
Myself and my daughters and our family, our goal today is for the next generation of young women who are using feminine hygiene products today to please read the warning labels that are on the boxes of these products or inside on pamphlets, and have an awareness that if you have any flu-like symptoms, you could be endangering your life, and to remove the product and seek medical attention immediately. That simple warning came 30 or 45 days too late to save my wife's life.
Today, nearly 20 years after the first outbreak, the numbers of syndrome cases caused by tampons have declined sharply, but they have not disappeared. Hundreds of incidents are still reported each year. Thanks to new diagnostic tools and early detection, many of those lives can now be saved.